Hi, and welcome to About Our Hope, where we talk about God, Jesus, and why we do what we do in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I am your host, Callie Baker, and I am so grateful that you are here. So grateful for you listening today. Today's topic is a little bit of a tricky one. Basically, what we're going to talk about is my thoughts on ex-Mormon content creators, and there's a lot that goes into this. And I will say that I've gone back and forth on whether or not to do this episode for a couple of reasons. The first reason is because I have felt like if you haven't already been exposed to this content, I don't necessarily want to be the one to introduce you. But the thing about that I realize is it's similar to like parents who avoid or don't want to talk to their kids about, anything really, but let's take drugs, for example. And they think that by not talking to their kids about drugs, it means that they're not going to do drugs. And we just all know that that's not true, and that their kids are going to be exposed to drugs whether or not they talk to them about it. And that's kind of how this feels to me. I did a poll on my Instagram story, and the question was, does ex-Mormon content pop up on your feed without you looking for it? And the results were honestly like astounding. The options were yes, every once in a while, not really, or never. And the results were 65% of you said yes, 28% said every once in a while, and then 5% not really, and 2% never. So overall, what that is saying is that 93% of you are seeing this content without looking for it. So we need to talk about it. So this is a really tricky episode for me to know the right way to do it, because I want to come at this from as positive of a view as I can. I don't want this to be a negative episode or a downer or bashing people or anything like that. So the way that I want to approach this podcast is more of, here are some practical tips and some practical kind of mindset shifts for when you see this content, so that you know how to approach it and ultimately you're not as afraid of it. I think as active members of the church, we don't know what to do when we come across this content. It's like, number one, is this even true? Number two, should I even look into it more? Number three, like, I shouldn't even be looking at this at all. And so it's like a really hard situation. And so my goal is for you to not feel intimidated by it. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm saying that you should go seek it out. That is not what I'm saying at all. Like I said at the beginning, that is not my goal to introduce you to this content, but I know that you're going to see it. I know that you are seeing it regardless. And these are just a lot of things that have helped me so that I am able to discern what is true, what is good, what is right in this content. So let's start from a place of intention. What do I feel like the intentions of these content creators are? Truthfully, at the end of the day, I can't say, right? I can't say what their intentions are, but what I can say is that I truly believe that they have, and I'm just going to name a couple of people here so that we're on the same page of who I'm thinking about. And I think that what I'm about to say could apply to anyone that you see on social media that is posting against the church content. But the kind of two main people that I see, or maybe three, are Alyssa Grenfell and Haley Rawl. She's the host of the Girls Camp podcast. And then the third one is John DeLynn. He's the host of Mormon Stories, which it's so funny. If you haven't heard these names before, you might be like, wait, those are podcasts against the church? Because they use tricky names. Like, those both sound like they could be like positive things for the church, but they're not. So that is one thing that's good to note. They use tricky names, so if you just see something online, you can't trust it at face value. But anyway, I have listened to more of Alyssa Grenfell and Haley Rawl. I feel like John DeLynn is a little bit more, he was more like really big and popular, I would say, a few years ago. So I truthfully haven't listened to really much Mormon Stories, but I have listened to a lot of Girls Camp and Alyssa Grenfell. So those are kind of the two people that I have in mind while I'm making this. But like I said, we could apply it to anybody. So back to what I was saying, I think that these women have every right to share their story and to share their experience. I am such a big advocate of freedom of speech, freedom of religion. And so I think that these girls have every right to share their experience and share their story and to share what they believe. And I also think that they have every right to criticize what we believe. Like, that is allowed in our society, and I think that it is okay. However, on the flip side of that, I also think that I have every right to share what I believe, to share my story, to talk about my beliefs, and then also to criticize or deconstruct what they believe. And I think that this is uncomfortable for a lot of members of the church because I've mentioned this before, but we generally tend to be nice and to not want to be like criticizing anyone. But if they're coming from a place of criticizing our beliefs, I think it's okay for us and for me, and I think I'll probably do this more in the future, but to kind of break down what they're saying they believe and what I agree with and what I don't agree with what they're saying. And I will just say here that when I listen to these women and I listen to their stories, I have so much compassion for them. And it's not compassion in like a pity way, but it's just like true compassion for their experiences. I mean, we all know people who have had really, truly negative experiences in the church. And while I personally don't think that that should sway your opinion of the church as a whole, you can have a lot of compassion for people. And if you haven't already had negative experiences in the church, you will within your life. I know that I've had bad experiences with priesthood leaders. I've had members say rude things to me, and it's genuinely hard. So I just want to note that I do have compassion for their beliefs, but that doesn't mean that I don't also have the right or opportunity to be able to share what I believe, even if it's different than what they believe, and to talk about what I disagree with them. And this podcast is not like, I'm not going to go into any of the specific anti-Mormon like claims or content. This is just an episode for how to approach that content when you see it. But I am going to point you to some resources where if you have had something come up, you've had a question come up, that you can go to see a like positive response to that. And I will also say that I'm sure there is a part of them that feels like they are really helping people. And that's great. However, just I personally don't want to be defined by what I'm not, by what I've left, by what I hate. I want to be defined by who I am. It feels kind of like when someone is stuck in high school, they've graduated, but they still go to all the games, all of their friends are still in high school, they want to know all the drama, etc. It reaches a point where, in my opinion, it's time to move on. And I will say that Haley Rawls has said recently that she plans to pivot more of her content from deconstructing the Mormon faith to reconstructing her own beliefs. And I'll just say good for her, and we'll see kind of where that goes. And another thing that I want to address is there is just a little bit of a conflict of interest, which this is with every content creator. So I'm not saying that this is specifically just for these ex-Mormon content creators, but obviously the more views that their videos get, the more money they're going to make. And so I think that sometimes this builds the wrong incentive in this specific content, because the crazier it is and the crazier it sounds, the more views it's going to get. So that is something that is really important to keep in mind when you are seeing this content pop up, and it's just like kind of the most like outrageous claim ever. That's drawing more people in. One thing that I've heard Jacob Hansen say that I think is absolutely right is that Alyssa Grenfeld's content has become a little bit more of what he calls cult porn. If you look at her followers, most of them aren't ex-members of the church or even like current members. Most of them have never been affiliated with the church whatsoever. They're just people who are curious about this religion that they saw on Netflix or this religion that they heard about, and they just want to know more about it, and like they just want that cult porn. And so like I said, it's not that these like women should be held to a higher standard than other content creators in the way of like, yeah, if you get more views, you're going to make more money. So like you understand, but it's just important to understand that that is an incentive, and that is an incentive to be more outrageous. Another thing on the conflict of interest is John Dehlin literally coaches people, like people pay him to coach them while they are leaving the church. So he has a podcast that literally criticizes the Mormon church, points people away from the church, and then he charges people for a coaching service. Just something to note. Seems a little bit like a conflict of interest to me, but we'll just leave it at that. Moving on now to how to approach this content when you see it, I'll just start by talking about how I always felt towards this content when I saw it initially. I was always so nervous about it. It scared me. Whenever I saw someone who was leaving the church and they would note one of these ex-Mormon content creators as like a main reason why or as a part of it, it made me nervous. It made me think, what do they know that I don't know? And what is the church hiding? And I can't go look at that content or else I might leave too. So if that's how you feel, know that you are not alone in that feeling. Know that it is so totally normal. And what's actually really interesting is as I was thinking about this and preparing for this podcast, I realized that the two major fears that I had are the two main things that I hear a lot of ex-Mormon content creators criticize about current members of the church. And what they will say is they will say that we are naive and that we are brainwashed. And that naive feeling of what do they know that I don't know, that's something that I experience. And then we're brainwashed. The feeling of is the church hiding something? I can't go look there. So let's talk about these two major feelings. First, let's talk about naivete. That's a hard word to say. I hope I said it right. So a matter of definition here that I want to talk about is the word apologetics. I recently learned what this word means. So it's not about making an apology for the church, but what apologetics is it's explaining why we do something, why we believe something. And it goes for any religion. There's Catholic apologetics, there's Christian apologetics. I'm sure there's a million other kinds. But so understanding apologetics, the reason why that's important to understand is that is the world of ex-Mormon content. It is apologetics. They're taking it from obviously the negative point of view, but they're explaining why we do what we do in the church. And I think that it's important to know the apologetics of the church. Obviously, that's kind of the whole goal of my podcast, is to help more people understand the actual literal logical reasons for why we do what we do. But here are just a couple of things I'll say about that to start. Number one, you don't need to listen to ex-Mormon content to learn the apologetics of the church. That is what they will make you feel, is that the only place you're going to get the truth is from them. And that is just simply not true. The church has basically posted all of the sticky parts of the church in the gospel topics essays. So that's literally on the church's website. And then there are also so many independent content creators that are coming out now explaining more of the apologetics. And they will say the exact claims from these ex-Mormon, anti-Mormon content creators. So don't feel like you have to go to them to get their side. I'm not saying you can't go to them, because I do think that that's something that is hard for members to hear when leaders in the church say don't look at it, because it creates this illusion of, like I said, hiding something. I'm not saying that. I'm assuming you're an adult. If you're watching this, you can go watch whatever you want, but you do not need to. You do not need to watch that content to get the opposite side, to get the opposite point of view. And the second thing I will say about knowing the apologetics of the church is I personally, now this might not be exactly right, this is just what I personally think, I don't think you need to learn it until you want to. Because the reality is there are a lot of things that you'll hear from ex-Mormon content creators that are simply not true, are just truly actually lies. But then there are things about the church that are true but can still be hard to hear. And so I think it's important that you come from a place of wanting to learn, because these things can be hard to understand initially. So it's important that you give it the appropriate amount of time and the appropriate amount of research to learn the reasons why. Okay, now let's talk about the brainwashed feeling. Is the church hiding something? I think that this feeling can come from, in large part, if you grew up a member of the church and then later on you find out about something in church history that makes you uncomfortable and you think, well, I never learned that. I never learned that in primary. That's not the version I was told. And I heard this explained so well, I thought, on Word Radio from Cardin Ellis. He said that we teach kids the Disney version of the gospel. I think this is such an accurate way to look at it. It's not that the church is hiding something from you growing up in the church, but it's about things that are age appropriate. And so, yeah, as a kid, you were taught the Disney version in primary, and that is okay. I do think it would be good if there was something in place when you were more in young men's, young women's to learn about all of these things, learn about the apologetics. Ultimately, these should be conversations that are happening at home, but the church isn't hiding it. I already mentioned the gospel topics essays. My husband actually took an institute class on all of the controversial parts of the church, which was really awesome. And so I think it's important to note that the church isn't hiding it, but it's not the church's focus. So let's talk about that a little more, and let's talk about what is the purpose of the church. I heard this explained in a video from Jacob Hansen, and he broke it down into basically 4 purposes. The first one being devotional, so like spiritual experiences, which we obviously see that be a big focus in the church with our worship on Sunday. The second being educational, which we also see that in church on Sunday and Sunday school, learning about the scriptures, and then like with Come Follow Me. The third purpose being ministry, which is just like a huge focus of the church. We see that as like in our wards, in the service within our wards, and then also the church on a global scale, how much ministry the church does. And then the fourth being apologetics. And apologetics is something that hasn't been a major focus of the church. But when you look at those other 3 categories, it kind of makes sense because those 3 things are, in my opinion, way more important for the church to be focusing on. It's not necessarily the church's job to defend what we believe, it's more to shepherd those who do believe. And so you see that through the devotional, educational, and ministry. But that doesn't mean that apologetics isn't important or that it's like not encouraged or focused on in the church whatsoever. I love this quote on why this is important from Jeffrey R. Holland. It says, "Though argument does not create conviction, lack of argument destroys belief. What seems to be proved may not be embraced, but what no one shows the ability to defend is quickly abandoned. Rational argument does not create belief, but it maintains a climate in which belief may flourish." I love this so much, and I think that it's a perfect way to think about this topic. Rational argument and reasoning isn't the main thing that is going to make you have a testimony. What's going to make you have a testimony is your devotional experiences, is your spiritual experiences. But if you don't have the rational argument to back it up, then I think that that's where these ex-Mormon content creators come in and can create a lot of doubt because they are looking at things from that more logical point of view. And if you don't already know these answers, then that could be a little shaky. But just because you don't know the answers and you don't know the reasons why we do what we do in the church, it doesn't mean that they're not there. Because this hasn't been a focus of the church, I think a lot of members and even a lot of leaders, they don't know the apologetics of the church because it's not a focus. And so when someone comes to them with a question or a concern, their response is something like, just pray about it and have faith. And while that's not a bad response, it is not the only response. You are not asked to just pray about things and just have faith. And I shouldn't say just because those are 2 huge things, but you can look more into these things and you can understand the reasoning behind them. And I know that as I have done that, my testimony of the church has only gotten stronger. Like, it is seriously so cool, the reasons for why we do what we do on a spiritual level, a logical level, a psychological level. I love looking at all of the different angles of truth. And I can just tell you that we have the most cool doctrine and theology of any religion. At least that's obviously what I believe because I'm in this religion. So don't be afraid to dive deeper into your testimony. Don't feel like you have to just lock these concerns, lock that thing, that reel, that TikTok that you saw that made you uncomfortable. You don't have to just lock that away in your mind and pray that it never comes out and that you can just have enough faith. You don't need to do that. It's okay to have questions, and it is like so good for you to learn more about our faith. Another concept that I feel like really applies to this situation is the concept of it is easier to tear something down than it is to build something up. It's like the quote, and this is going to be modified because it has a swear word in it. Not even a super swear word, but I can't say it. But it says, anyone can kick down a barn, but it takes a good carpenter to build one. That's from Sam Rayburn. And that's just so true. That is part of why these accounts have been so successful, because it's easy. It's easy to post something inflammatory and controversial, and lies are quick and short and eye-catching and grabby, whereas the truth takes time to understand. It takes time to unpack. This quote from the Lie and Truth letter is pretty crazy, this stat. It says false news online travels 6 times faster than the truth, according to a 2018 study by researchers at MIT. A lie online is clean and short. The truth has depth and takes time to understand. So like I mentioned, when you hear something that makes you uncomfortable, be willing and be patient enough to take the time necessary to understand the truth about it. And we're going to talk about a lot of good resources for you to learn the truth about it. Okay, now we're going to move into talking about some of the tactics that I see ex-Mormon content creators using online that ultimately are manipulative. And the reason that I want to go through some of these is this is part of what makes it not scary, because once you can notice some of these tactics in their content, you can recognize the ways that it's kind of manipulative and they're kind of manipulating your emotions and how you feel about the church, about how you feel about the history of the church and the doctrine of the church. I love this quote from the Light and Truth letter, and all of the tactics that I'm going to go through come from the Light and Truth letter. So I'll just take a minute to explain what that is. This is an amazing resource. This is like probably one of the number one places I would tell you to go to learn about these topics from the perspective of an active member. What it is it's Austin Fife. He went through a faith crisis, and he breaks down almost every like controversial topic and what ultimately has helped him to resolve that. He says that it's not like comprehensive. It's not like he's like, this is the perfect answer for it, but it is so helpful. So this is a quote from him in the Lie and Truth letter. It's available on YouTube for you to listen to, or I look at the PDF online a lot. Okay, so he says, I learned that the information is not the problem. The real issue is in the The real issue is in the interpretation. Critics tried to convince me that they only shared what the church did not want me to know. When examined carefully, I realized that most everything new the critics shared was relatively innocuous and came from church sources. Ultimately, the manipulation happens in the presentation of data and history, not in the data and history itself. So that's really important when we go into looking at these different tactics, because really what they do is kind of twist the truth. So I just took a few of the tactics that I feel like I see the most, but there's even more, and I will post them, a link in the description, and then I'll post them on my Instagram. So let's get into it. The first one is the myth of infallibility. So this is an assumption that church leaders must be infallible, that they must not make mistakes. This is something that we don't believe. We do not believe that God's servants are perfect and that they never make mistakes. But the critics of the church use this a lot to create doubt, and it's really easy for them because all they have to do is, number one, assume that church leaders are infallible, and number two, show an example of infallibility. And an example of that would be any church policy or thing from history that we once believed and once was implemented that we don't anymore. But we believe that we are a restored church. We believe that that restoration is ongoing and that this lie of infallibility is not accurate. This is not what we believe. You will see them use that one a lot. Okay, the next one is the big list, Gish Gallop, or proof by verbosity. So this one is when they use an illusion of proof for something because of just the sheer mass of information that is given about it. An example of this is the CES letter, which you've probably heard of. But the CES letter, it's basically just a combination of like every doubt or like criticism of the church all in one letter. And the thing is, it's written in a way to doubt bomb you. It creates a feeling of, even if you could resolve this one issue, there are a million other that you can't resolve. And it's created, and this tactic is used in a way to overwhelm you. So if you ever feel overwhelmed by hearing just a bunch of things back to back to back, that is a tactic of manipulation, because those things might all have responses. They probably do. But like we said, it takes time to understand those responses, and it's really easy to just spout lies one after the other, or to spout like negativity one after the other. The next tactic is presentism, and we see this just so much in our world in general today. It's assuming that a historical figure should be judged by the same things that we believe now in our present day. This is popular. It's popular to take something out of context and to make people seem like just these awful people. But the fact is, if you were in that position, if the critics were in that position, if I was in that position, we probably would have all acted in the same way. Anything that you take from 200 years ago without historical and cultural context is going to seem weird. And you will see critics do this all the time by spouting off ages that people got married or anything like that. I know that you can think of a bunch of examples off the top of your head too. And so this is really popular to do because it's eye-catching, but it is misleading. The next one is naturalist assumptions. So you see this from like an atheist perspective, where they assume that nothing supernatural or spiritual happens in the world. Ultimately, I just see this as being really closed-minded. And on the one hand, it is like totally okay for you to believe something differently than me, but you shouldn't be making me feel dumb about that. And that's kind of the main use of this tactic. They'll say something like, angels don't appear to men to give them golden plates. And they just say it in a way that makes you feel dumb for believing that. But I don't know about you, but I know God is real. I know that God interacts with the world. And so that is my beliefs. And I'm okay if someone doesn't want to believe that. I will respect them and their beliefs, but they should also offer that respect to me and what I believe. The next one, bully on the playground. So this is like exactly what it sounds like. It's using mockery and name calling to make you feel bad about your beliefs or to make you doubt your beliefs. The number one example of this is you're in a cult. I can't tell you, if I had, I don't know, maybe like $5 for every comment on my TikTok saying that I'm in a cult, I would have a good amount of money. That would be great. And really, that it doesn't bother me. It just makes me laugh. But I mean, we're all human at the same time. And so hearing these like name calling things, no one wants to be told they're weird for what they believe. This again goes back to the respect thing. And I think that at the end of the day, we can call this tactic what it is. It's literally being a bully. Okay, the next one, appeal to emotion. So this is when they are trying to win the argument, trying to win whatever the dispute is by manipulating your emotions. And I see this so much, especially in Haley Rawl and Alyssa Grenfeld's content. They come at it from a way that you feel like you are a terrible human being if you believe the church, if you believe differently than what they do. They state things in a way of absolutes. And so you have to be really careful if you hear anything like this, because it can make you just think that the way they're saying things is the way it is, and it's not. An example of this would be saying like the Mormon church hates LGBTQ people. It destroys their lives. And so you hear this and you're like, oh my gosh, well, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be a part of that. but it's just not true. Just because it is said in absolutes and it makes you feel bad, it doesn't mean it's true. That is literally manipulating your emotions. When someone speaks passionately about something, we want to believe them. We want to believe what they are saying is true. So it's just something to be aware of. Just because someone else believes it passionately doesn't make it true. Okay, the final one that we're going to talk about is generalization. So this is drawing a conclusion on something, on a broad thing, based on a small sample size. So we see this all the time. It's whenever you hear that someone had a bad experience with a church leader. Let's say that they didn't respond in the right way to a situation of abuse. And so now they are saying the church itself is abusive. While it can be really sad, those individual experiences, this goes back to the infallibility. We don't believe that leaders are perfect, and we can't make generalizations based on a small sample size. And so these critics will use these anecdotal examples, these stories of people, to prove an untrue concept. And while, like I mentioned at the very beginning, I think that people have extremely valid experiences, and I will completely offer compassion to that, it does not make this generalization tactic okay. Okay, now moving into some resources that you can go look at if you have seen something that has made you question, so that you can learn more about it from, in my mind, a trustworthy source. So like I said, I already mentioned the Light and Truth letter. That's a great one. Another one that I have seen pop up is the Blonde Apologist. That's her Instagram, and then she has a podcast. Her name is Lauren. She's awesome. I see her address, I feel like she addresses a lot of more of the cultural aspects of the church, which I think is so awesome. So she's super cute. She has a really cute Instagram and TikTok. So she is a great resource. She is covering a lot of these topics. Another one on Instagram is Scripture Plus. I've seen people repost this, so I think that she's kind of getting around, but she just has quick responses to a lot of these as well, which can be a good resource to just see a little snippet. A couple of good YouTube channels that I like are Thoughtful Faith, that's Jacob Hansen, Word Radio, and The Stick of Joseph. A lot of them will cover, I would say, some of the more mainstream criticisms against the church, a lot of the church history and that sort of thing. So I hope that this list at least gives you somewhere to start. I tried to name quite a few so that you can find your right style, because this is just like with any other content. You have to find someone who fits your right style. And hopefully, keep following along here. I would love to be a resource to you to cover some of these sticky, controversial topics. I say this all the time, but please don't be afraid to send me in your questions and your concerns. I would love to at least point you in the right direction or make a video about it. And I'm going to just keep chipping away at these topics one by one, so that eventually we'll have a good library here of responses to some of these harder parts of the church. Okay, so I just want to end on, I grabbed my scriptures here, a couple of verses, and these are actually the verses that my whole podcast is based on, where the name About Our Hope comes from. And it's in 1 Peter 3. I'm going to read 14 and 15. So it says, "But and if ye suffer for righteousness' sake, happy are ye. And be not afraid of their terror, neither be troubled. But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear." So these criticisms about the church, they are literally biblical. And I love these verses so much because they literally tell us here to not be afraid. It says, "Be not afraid of their terror, neither be troubled. If we suffer for righteousness' sake, happy are we." And I will just say that that could not be more true in my personal life. I also love the focus here of sanctify the Lord God in your hearts. Like I mentioned before, these rational arguments, these apologetics of the church, that's not the only thing that creates belief. A huge part of what creates belief are our personal spiritual experiences. And so I would just encourage you to always be doing that. Always be sanctifying the Lord God in your heart. However you do that, by worshiping Him, reverencing Him as holy. That is the number one most important thing to be doing through whatever journey you're on, if you are in any sort of faith crisis or trying to answer questions. Keep God in the center, keep God in your heart. And I also love that this just gives us absolute permission to pursue these apologetics, to pursue these answers when it says, be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is in you. So I just hope that this podcast today really encouraged you to not be afraid of these ex-Mormon content creators, to not be nervous about it, but to be confident in your faith, be confident in your beliefs, be confident and patient enough to seek the truth, to seek to understand the truth, to not just take these lies or criticisms at face value, but to dive deeper into this gospel. All right, so as always, thank you so much for being here. I truly appreciate it. I always say this, but thank you so much for those of you who reach out and tell me in person and through DMs and texts what you are thinking about the podcast. I love to hear your thoughts about it. That encourages me so much, so thank you for that. As always, please subscribe if you haven't already, like and share this video, and I will see you soon.